So I wanted to make a video challenging physicalism and the scientific worldview, broadly speaking. I'm not entirely sure if the camera's even working, but I hope you understand what I have to say anyway. I suppose I'll leap right in with it, with the problem consciousness. Consciousness, experience, and qualia seem to be wholly immaterial substances, which means a completely physicalist worldview struggles to accommodate them, and yet they're all we ever really come into contact with, so best we can say they're probably the foundation of things, or a good reason to think so. Of course, physicalists attempt to explain this as an epiphenomena, but if everything we experience is just an epiphenomena, then the whole foundation of science is undermined, because then the empirical data they treasure so much is just some weird epiphenomena. Doesn't really mean anything at all. And how? There are other good reasons to think it doesn't mean anything at all. I mean, from what we know, we only perceive a tenth of a millionth of the potential electromagnetic spectrum, so it puts us pretty close to a blind Cape salamander on the grand scheme of things. We're really not that aware of things. We don't really experience much of what's going on around us. We're pretty blind to what's going on around us. There's so many assumptions in science. One of them is the assumption of an independently existing material world, or at least such a world that possesses the qualities in such a way that they're similar to how we experience things. So the redness of the rose kind of independently exists when you close your eyes. Of course it does not. The experience of colour depends on the nervous system, the optical system. Without that, the experience of colour will never be generated. And colour, as far as I'm concerned, refers to qualia. That's all we ever really experience. Never experience any colour other than that, so why bother talking about it? Yes, the things that would cause colour, were there a mind there, may well still exist in some sense, but they're completely unintelligible because our experience of them is so limited. There are so many problems, really, though. Those senses we're just talking about, I mean, they're only really the product of a brutal economy that underpins natural selection. I mean, we only really see enough to breed and eat, and that's just that. There are a few other assumptions of science, and one of them is the visibility of subjects to experience. I mean, you and I, as we sit here now, are both subjects to experience, we're subject of awareness or consciousness. Now, who are we to assume where that begins and ends? I mean, plants, bacteria, rocks, water. Why do we just assume that only the biochemicals in the human body produce subjective experience? No good reason to. What is that awareness anyway? I mean, awareness is really best understood by the absence of inequalities. That's how it can accommodate all of this myriad experience we're exposed to. It's like a mirror can't have any colours of its own, and that's how a mirror can reflect things, much like the mind. But because of that fundamental emptiness of the mind, it makes it something that is not subject to change. So in a sense, it's kind of unchanging, permanent, unchanging, eternal, being beyond time and space. Because time and space just occur within awareness, you see. Space-time just occurs within awareness. And there's this fundamental problem with thought in general that I think you can agree with me that reality only exists in the present moment, and yet it is impossible to think about the present moment in a literal sense, because by the time you've thought about something, it's already passed. Experience is so impermanent, and I think it's the impermanence of experience which drives so many scientifically minded people to cling to the idea of an external world so dearly, and it's why so many of the kind of militant atheist bands and the mega science minds get so defensive and angry so quickly? Why is that? What is it psychologically that underpins that and drives that? We always ask, why do religious people want there to be an afterlife so much? Well, that's a good question, but it's also a good question to ask, why do atheists not want there to be an afterlife? I have mixed feelings about whether I want there to be an afterlife or not. The potential for it to be a negative one seems awfully, unappealing. So it's kind of easy to just choose to write it all off, but who knows what happens? Who knows what we'll experience when we die? I mean, on the subject of the afterlife, it does go off tangent a little bit, and I tend to do that, but I do apologise. People talk about heaven and hell as if they're like Hawaii. Does it exist? I mean, I think that's very naive. I think that's really just setting up a straw man argument about the afterlife question. Because even in the Bible it says the kingdom of heaven or kingdom of God is within you, which would imply it's never talking about a kind of physical external place that people are going to get to. And of course, many Christians, many religions have misunderstood this, but it's beside the point, I suppose. There's still a potential gem of truth somewhere in there, because isn't it true that at the point of death, what the human mind is liable to experience is open to real infinite possibilities? I mean, even our perception of time seems to be partly constructed by the mind itself. I mean, the idea of it stretching out into eternity or what have you. You just kind of ignore this whole like other potential metaphysical worldview, like Platonism and Neoplatonism, but perfectly valid philosophical possibilities. You can't necessarily prove them, certainly, but then you can't prove science, certainly, either. You can't prove the external world, certainly. You really can't prove much at all with much certainty, which means, we shouldn't just desperately cling to our ideas. There's a Chinese poem that says, it really caught my attention. It said, "Do not pursue the truth. Simply let go of your cherished opinions." There's such an arrogance to this compulsive objectification of what is actually a very deeply subjective experience of life, existence, and reality. The great philosopher, the great German philosopher Schopenhauer said that, the real philosopher's quest for the truth is about trying to understand what the basic fabric of reality is, and it's a bit like trying to open a vast black box. But all the scientist ever does is break that box into smaller chunks and give them labels and names, strings of sounds of words, so that we can talk about them, endlessly talk about them and write about them, always for the sake of vanity, really. I've digressed. Once again, I apologise. And lost my train of thought. I confess I'll turn to my notes to remind me of something to say, because I thought about it a lot. I suppose another of the kind of challenges is this idea of a mind's eye. I mean, when you dream and when you imagine things, when you remember things, only really kind of experiencing that not through any of the five senses, but through kind of different sense, if you will. I don't want to call it a sixth sense because of all of the silly paranormal connotations of that term, but in Buddhism they would have called it the sixth sense in a non-paranormal sense, just the mind's eye. But if you look closely, then we experience everything through the mind's eye. I mean, the five senses are like rivers flowing into just one open awareness. Again, an awareness best understood in terms of its voidness or emptiness qualities, something which of course is discussed in depth by the Zen Buddhist tradition. And there's a text called The Awakening of Faith, which I really would love many of you scientific thinkers to read, because it seems to be a very rational discourse about the relationship between the subject and the object. And, you guys kind of objectify subjective experience, but what is the subject? What is the relationship between the subject? Does the mind exist within the body, as you insist, or does the body exist within the mind? Think about it right now in this moment. Your body is just an experience within awareness. And that is why it is so tempting for the mystic to say that awareness is primary. Awareness being this unchanging emptiness. Come on, that's kind of interesting. And yet, you could never look at a subject through the empirical method. You can't use the five senses to see a subject. You know, it's weird, we never really meet one another. You just hear my voice and see my skin through your pitifully limited five senses. You never see me, we never really meet. You never really meet anyone. No one ever really knows you, knows what you are. They can't see you, no one ever sees you. Because the subject, whilst we know it exists, it is self-evident to exist, is not visible or audible beyond all, even to ourselves. There's a great Buddhist sutra that says if you want to know what the fabric of awareness is, you have to look for the thing that is present, both in sound and in silence. I won't go into panpsychism, but panpsychism is a possibility that science just writes off, that it's perfectly possible. We don't know where consciousness begins and ends. The ants have no idea that we are subjects to a life. Goodness knows what creatures are around us. Why not call them gods? Yes, experience being fundamentally mind-dependent. I mean, the tree falling in the woods, guys, it really just doesn't make a sound. I'm sorry. The experience of the sound is everything we ever use the word sound to refer to, and it does not create that unless there's a mind there. So, you know, you can't account for that stuff. There's Alfred North Whitehead. He's got a fallacy of simple location. He emphasizes how, Alfred North Whitehead, British philosopher, 1920s, 30s, kind of lectured in philosophy and actually started off 2-3 decades lecturing at Oxbridge universities on mathematical physics. So he kind of started off in science. After his son died, he got into philosophy. He said, one of the problems with science, fallacy of simple location, focuses on little bits of things instead of really understanding the complex interrelationships between things, interconnectedness, interdependence between things, which is far broader than the scientific method can presently really adequately conceive. But I think his more important criticism is the fallacy of misplaced concrescence or concreteness, making things solid where in fact they're not, projecting kind of object into the world, which is actually a construct of the human mind. I think a good example of this is gravity, because we see things falling. We give a word to it, gravity, and it becomes this concept. And then we project it back into reality and say gravity exists out there in the world, not just a mind thing anymore. It's out there. And yet we're puzzled when we cannot find a graviton. We cannot really physically explain gravity. Well, that's because you're kind of chasing a figment of your own intellect or imagination. And I think that's a pretty brutal criticism of science. The issues of noumenal, phenomenal relation, Kantian idea of the absolute mind is completely ignored by science, because you can't look at it with the five senses. Well, how about reason? How about exploring possibilities and acknowledging alternative possibilities instead of just blindly assuming that all of them are just incorrect and that only physicalism and scientific worldview are correct? I mean, we're kind of bizarre culture, we're a freak culture, because historically human cultures have been far more in tune with the subjective nature of reality and the kind of spiritual dimensions of things that won't go into such trite cliches. And we're kind of perversely obsessed with objectification, and that's why we objectify one another. And I question the kind of psychology behind that. Like, why do you cling so dearly to this secure and solid, controllable, possessible world that you create with your intellect and imagination? It is not coherent with what is actually given to you in the raw moment by the senses.